Welcome back. Now, a group of South African citizens and embassy staff evacuated from Sudan landed safely at the Tambo International Airport this afternoon. Today marks exactly 2 weeks since the Sudan Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces declared war on each other. To date, about 450 civilians and combatants have been confirmed dead, with both the African Union and the United Nations raising fears that the conflict has potential to spread to neighboring northeastern nations. For more on the safe arrival of the South Africans back home, we are now joined on the line by Clayson Monyela, who speaks for the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. Mr. Monyela, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Now, just to maybe give us an overall number, how many South Africans can you confirm were evacuated out of Sudan?
Good evening, and thanks for having us on your platform. Firstly, let me just give you the latest update. We are expecting the group of South Africans that we successfully evacuated from Sudan to arrive tomorrow morning just before 11. The Minister of International Relations, Minister Naledi Pandor, will be at the airport to receive them. Today, this afternoon, just after 4, we received 10 South African nationals who were also in Sudan. They were made their way to Port Sudan and successfully crossed into Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. Our Consul General and his team received them in Saudi Arabia and provided on-the-ground support, and they were able to fly back to South Africa this afternoon. Their employer actually paid for those tickets. The group that is arriving tomorrow is the group of South African nationals and embassy staff that was evacuated at the cost of the South African government. We paid for the buses that moved them out of Sudan. We facilitated their crossing into Egypt, put them into hotels, and they've been there until this evening when they are flying back, supported by the South African National Defense Force Special Forces, and they will be arriving tomorrow morning. This was not an easy operation, as you can imagine. We had the support of organizations like Give Up Give Us. They paid for an extra bus in addition to the ones paid for by government. We would also like to acknowledge the support of countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Sudan itself. So we can confirm that the initial number of 77 confirmed South African nationals that we initially spoke about, all of them are accounted for and safely out of Sudan.
That's absolutely great news, and like as much as you highlight, this operation has been described as highly sensitive and complex. Can you just take us through some of the processes that you needed to go through as a department to ensure that this is successful?
Yeah, so if you think about a country where there is intense fighting, your own embassy team being on the ground, worried and unsure about, the next day, certain countries that I'm sure you're aware of moved in and evacuated the embassy staff and left their nationals there. We didn't do that. We opted to keep our embassy staff to take care of the South African nationals. We're also stranded and stuck in Sudan until we could put together an operation to move everyone out and not leaving anyone behind. They had to go through several checkpoints manned by the two warring factions because this had to be a ground operation because the airspace is closed. The fighting involved airstrikes, so you couldn't fly in. The airport was damaged as well. So had to go through several checkpoints, traveled for more than 14 hours by bus with very little supplies. And some of the nationals left their travel documents, passports in Sudan because they left in a hurry. So when they got to the border with Egypt, initially some of them were refused entry, which led to frustrations and a lot of calls of worried families. Eventually, we negotiated with the foreign ministry because we had deployed diplomats from our South African embassy in Egypt to be at the border to receive them, and we successfully got them into Egypt, and they were tired and hungry. We put them into hotels just to get some rest, and the South African National Defence Force, as I say, were on hand to provide the necessary support, and they are responsible for moving them out now. As we say, they're on their way back home. So we'd like to thank the support and cooperation of everyone that made this possible.
Most certainly. And I mean, other countries, like you mentioned, left some of their nationals in Sudan, but South Africa has also assisted some of the nationals from some of our SADC regions. Can you tell us which of those countries these nationals come from, and how many of them form part of that 77 that you mentioned earlier?
Oh, yes, certainly. We received requests from some of the neighboring countries in SADC to assist their nationals as we were evacuating South African nationals. When we moved people out of Khartoum, we had nationals of Angola, Lesotho as well. Zimbabweans. In fact, in the group that's arriving tomorrow, we've got one Zimbabwean national. We also have one British national that we also assisted. So we're happy that we're able to assist nationals of other friendly countries that we, collaborate with and work with very closely in our line of work as diplomats.
Lastly, Clayson, what processes did you embark on to guard against irregular expenditure? I mean, you mentioned that some of the companies had paid for the flights for some of the nationals that were moved out, but there was also hotel expenses and, of course, those that are coming in tomorrow, which you needed to ensure that they are flown back into South Africa.
So when you deal with an emergency like this one, which wouldn't have been anticipated at the beginning of the financial year, you have to follow due process and the applicable prescripts in government that allow for approvals to be granted. What you have to make sure is that all the necessary documentation and processes are followed and approvals are granted so that at the end of the financial year, you don't get into trouble with auditors. So all of that was done. So we're quite happy that no process was skipped, and we are okay. We've secured the necessary approvals.
All right, Clayson Monyela, thank you so much for joining us this evening and giving us that update. And we will be looking forward to the remaining 10, or rather the number of embassy staff and South Africans that will be landing tomorrow at the Tambo International Airport.